Can you hear me okay? All right, so we're talking a lot about new technologies today, and one of the key issues that is a long-standing issue is how people react to new technologies, how new technologies get adopted. And so I want to talk about two things today. One is just that general theme of technology adoption, which is really somewhat unique for food, but is an issue for all technologies. And then talk a little bit about the communication challenge. Certainly how we are thinking about communicating about a new technology, genome editing, in this case based on CRISPR-Cas for us, a technology that we think of as an advanced breeding or targeted breeding technology. So the language clearly is an important part of how we communicate. So those are the two topics I want to cover, and I want to start with a picture that I came across recently in kind of an unlikely place, but this is a magazine, Collier's. How many people have actually heard of Collier's? There's a few, actually. It actually went out of business a couple years after I was born, but it was a really important one in its time. And what this tells us, should you let your children fly? All right, so it's a reminder that new technologies can be a little unsettling. I think back in the 1800s, there was a lot of worry about high-speed travel, high speed being 25 miles an hour on a train. What would that do to people? You know, flying, what would that do to us? So it reminds us that the issue is long-standing. But it also talks about, the question is really important here, right? Should you let your children fly? Eleanor Roosevelt gives her advice. She wasn't a pilot, I don't think, and probably didn't know much about the mechanics of airplanes, but she probably was a very trusted voice when it comes to thinking about technology adoption. And so it brings up the other really critical question that we grapple with new technologies, which is the issue of trust and transparency. No new technology is going to get adopted unless there's trust in the technology developers and the ones who bring those technologies to the market. And how we generate that trust, how we engage with people to deserve trust, to earn trust, is part of the equation that we know is really critical and influences how we're thinking about talking about new technologies like genome editing today. Now, this was alluded to earlier, but it just raises the question again of who do we trust? There's a lack of trust, I would say, broadly in regulatory bodies across the world. Some regions worse than others, this reminds us that the people that we trust are not necessarily the ones we might have trusted as a society 20 or 30 years ago. And so in some of the work we've done engaging with small groups around genome editing, it's clear that if your cousin posts something and they've read a paper about genome editing that gets them comfortable or uncomfortable and then posts on Facebook and then their friends read it, that's more important than what the USDA is probably saying about the technology. And so as we think about how we communicate, this is a really important issue today, that we have to reach people and engage with people in maybe non-traditional manners. We've also learned, and this was, I think, Jerry Feidelson mentioned something in one of the small rooms, that when we think about talking to people, we can't think about this as a one-way communication. And I think if we made mistakes in prior technology adoptions, and obviously GMO comes to mind, is that this is not about sort of educating people. This is not a one-way ticket to say, if you just understand the technology, you're going to know this is fine. The issue of technology adoption is far much about emotion than it is about information. And so we have to focus on engagement and not education as we work with people and help them be part of the discussion, be part of the engagement about how technology will come to the market. And how we talk about it is the key issue. So we've spent quite a bit of time at DuPont Pioneer, in Europe, in Asia, in the US, with a range of different stakeholder meetings. We're planning a meeting later in the summer. We're helping support a meeting that will be talking about CRISPR as a theme broadly, not just for agriculture, but in its other applications. And I think the key is, first of all, to find common ground with the people who will be using the technology. That's really critical, and to focus on the benefits. And I remember in the sort of biotech era, everyone saying, if you just had a product that would be meaningful to a customer, to an end user, to a consumer, it would change the dialogue. And of course, most of us in that time were working on a range of products, some of which truly were consumer-facing, but many of those weren't. I think with the technology like genome editing, if we do get social license with the technology, if public perception is appropriate, if the regulatory framework is suitable, then we will see very broad use of that technology. And I think that will actually help foster trust in the market. Instinctively, people look at big companies, and we're not necessarily the most trusted agents in their minds. And so it's going to be really important that this technology is very broadly used, we think, in the market with a range of crops, a range of companies, a range of organizations that can use it and bring products to the market based on it. So I want to shift a little bit and just show a few slides that help frame how we're talking about the technology, and we're still learning. We continue to talk to people and try to figure out the best way to reach a dialogue. And this just reminds us that the issues around genome editing are very broad. And so we have to, first of all, be very mindful that it isn't just about food or agriculture. It's about broader uses that could interact with, in people's minds, how they feel about food and technology. But two important points here. One is that we know that food is a somewhat unique issue for people when it comes to technology. It's different than, thinking about your cell phone. So food is really different, right? And in fact, agricultural applications will probably be the first applications of this new technology that people will interact with. We have a first product that we're looking at bringing out by 2020. It's a pretty simple initial corn product, a specialty starch corn product, but lays the foundation for future products to come. And I think the therapeutic applications will take much longer than that to reach general use. So how do we try to talk about this? One of the things we talk about is the fact that genome editing relies on very natural processes that all organisms have. And so this slide just shows that under stress of various types, we get double-stranded breaks in DNA that happens randomly. It's the source of natural variation, in fact. And plants, every other organism, has evolved mechanisms to repair that double-stranded break. Often that's a perfect healing, but sometimes that repair is imperfect, and that gives rise to the kind of variation that happens in nature that is harvested by breeders to create new varieties. But it also is what we can target in the genome to deliver changes that we want to introduce, whether they're edits or other changes. One of the things we try to do when we communicate is to talk at a level of story and narrative. And so a story I'll just share with you is that we're trying to help people understand that natural variation is part of what we're harvesting with this technology, and variation is happening all the time. So I've been backpacking for some 25 years, and for most of that time, every spring I go to Point Reyes National Seashore, right by the coast. And every year in March, there's just fields of wild mustard. And every year it's been just yellow. But if you look closely at this slide, what you'll see is there's a little sprinkling of white flowers there. And that's just an example of mutation happening in nature, showing up. And if we were breeders trying to improve mustard, we would be able to take advantage of those sorts of changes. These are the same changes that we use all the time. It's part of the breeding processes we've been relying on for our food for generations. And what we know is that breeding has a history of safe use. So we try to anchor to variation, we try to anchor to breeding. But interestingly enough, what we've learned as we listen to people is that breeding is not exactly a comfortable concept for them, or at least a familiar one. How many people know what breeding really is? I mean, what the actual process is. I see a couple of hands. Not a lot, right? And this is a room of people who are, technologically sophisticated. So your average person really doesn't understand breeding. And so anchoring why this new technology is safe to the fact that breeding is delivered safe food is a challenge. What we've recognized is, though, that there is an opportunity, I think today, particularly when people are very interested in where their food comes from, to talk to them, to engage with them, to help them perhaps understand that the varieties they find in the market come through natural variation, come through breeding, and therefore maybe we can actually connect with people at the level of food and help them see that this is going to be a very natural process. So this slide just illustrates what breeding has delivered. And it's all about natural variation. So that wild mustard plant I mentioned is the source of all of these different vegetables. And intuitively, when you go to the store, I don't think you're going to connect those to each other necessarily, certainly not to wild mustard. But they all come from relatively small changes, and they come from different parts of that mustard plant when it's been bred. So another thing we try to do is to give people analogies to think about with the technology. So it's genome editing, and we talk about editing as a function. We talk about what we experience every day, whether it's on our cell phone or on our iPad or on our computer, is word processing. And you have to have, for word processing, to edit a text, you need a search process, you need an edit function, and the tools, which I won't go into, that many of you are familiar with genome editing, basically have that function, and we can link that to the idea of text. The idea that the genome is just a set of instructions, it's just a text. It's a very large text compared to your average book, but it's just a text. And so we can help people understand at the level of editing text that you can edit the genome in the same way. And we have some different variants on this kind of a slide that link editing text to editing a genome text as well. So we can talk about deletion changes, editing changes, search and replace, where we can actually, for example, move a naturally occurring allele from one variety to another to facilitate the breeding process. Ultimately, we try to anchor people into two kinds of ways that we are committed to using this technology in an advanced plant breeding or targeted breeding approach. And this example just shows how we can harvest natural variation. So in this case, we're not even creating any new variation whatsoever. We're just accelerating the breeding process. And that acceleration seems maybe incremental, but that incremental change in speed and efficiency can make a massive change in the rate of gain that our farmers count on. And so if you have a variety on the right, for example, it's a very high quality variety, but it's sensitive to a disease, for example, and you find a disease problem emerging, and you can find a disease-resistant variety. If you did through classic breeding, the series of steps that are required, there'd be 5, 10, 15 generations to bring that single trait for disease resistance into that elite variety. It takes a lot of time, and actually the quality of that product, you don't get back to exactly the same high quality variety you started with. With genome editing, what we talk about is we get to the same outcome we would get through breeding, but just in 1 or 2 steps. And in fact, if we have to put together a number of different genes or alleles, or harvest multiple alleles, 2 or 3 or 4, then the process of conventional breeding is really, really slow compared to the same 1 or 2 cycles through this technology. So these are some of the ways we talk with regulators and others and sophisticated audiences, and we're trying to communicate with lay people around the world. What's important, I think, from our standpoint is that there's a tremendous potential for the use of this technology, not just in corn, and I just use the corn example because it's one that we're working on today. We're working on a number of other crops at Pioneer, including food crops like rice and wheat. We're also partnering and working with other companies to help facilitate their use of the technology based on either IP that we've developed or licensed or technology that we've created. And so, when you think about California agriculture, there will be many, many important applications of this technology. So just to wrap up, the important thing about communicating is listening, is seeking first to understand the other, the supply chain, the consumer, getting past thinking about just the farmer as the customer, but thinking about the end consumer. It's about food, not just agriculture, and so we're doing that, and we would encourage everyone to do that with their businesses. And finally, we think transparency is critical. And we're trying to find a range of ways to communicate. We've recently launched a small website. You can see, I think it's down at the bottom is the URL for that website. I have some cards in my pocket I can give you that will direct you to the website. The website is designed to do 2 things, really. It's provide some basic information about the technology. We'll update it as we go about products that we're developing. It's also meant a bit to personalize this process. And you can see on the top there, one of the categories is our scientists. So there's some stories about some of the scientists who are doing this work, and they're just like everyone else in the world. They're just people, and they have children, and they take their kids to play soccer and that sort of thing. So we're trying to personalize the process that we're doing here. Also on that website is our promise, is a set of commitments and a set of guiding principles about how we're using CRISPR-Cas for targeted breeding that you'll also see on the website. So these are some of the ways we're trying to communicate about new technology like this. I think that theme is important for all of us as we develop new technologies that the consumer really does have to get comfortable with before we get social license to enter the market with those products. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you for your time.
I think I'm going to open us up for questions, but I'd like to start, and we'll get to you next. So this is really fascinating, this CRISPR-Cas9 technology. It's a real game changer. I can see that. Could you talk a little bit about what that means for California ag and California crops?
Yeah. So, we've reached a time in the development of crop science where we now have sequenced some 150, as an industry, 150 or more crop genomes, and I think that's being added to probably on a daily basis. And for many of those crops, we know a lot about multiple genomes, multiple varieties. And so that core of information means that we can learn from a range of different varieties what happens in natural variation and apply that in other crops. And so there's no doubt that whether it's tomatoes or lettuce or peppers or other vegetables, specialty crops in California, grapes perhaps, almonds, all of these crops can be edited. And I'll just give one example of, I think, a pretty interesting one about disease resistance. So you got to think about the benefits. One of the challenges, I think, for producing specialty food is you got to protect and preserve the quality of that fruit. We do that often with pesticides. There's powdery mildew is an important pathogen on a range of crops, many specialty crops. And in barley, resistance to powdery mildew was discovered quite some time ago, and it results from the mutation of a single gene called MLO. Well, wheat, that never happened. Powdery mildew in wheat's a problem, but there was never natural variation discovered for that. Why? Wheat's a hexaploid. You'd have to get mutation in all 6 copies of that gene to get that resistance. Well, a group in China 2 years ago showed that using this technology, they could actually knock out all 6 copies of the gene in one time. And so now in wheat, we have powdery mildew resistance. Well, that gene exists in all the specialty crops we have in California. And so I think just as an example, for disease resistance, reducing pesticide load, we should be able to easily get resistance to powdery mildew in whether it's tomatoes or lettuce or spinach or a range of other crops, Roger.
Okay, thank you. Right over here, and where are my mic runners? We need a microphone for this guy. But go ahead, I'll repeat the question in the meantime.
I'll try to yell. Neal, I'm really glad to see that website for public dissemination, not of propaganda, but of information.
So we're trying.
And I just wanted to point out, it's not involving genome editing, but Okanagan Fruit Company, run by Neil Carter, just had their first release of Arctic apples. And they used, I believe, antisense RNA to turn down the gene. I think their website is spectacularly good at explaining the science to lay people and sort of demystifying it and making it familiar and comfortable. Even though it's a different technology, right, there may be some lessons that can be learned there.
That's a great point.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Any more questions? And by the way, your question should end in a question mark if possible. Any more questions? So, okay, right here in the middle.
Tell us about your understanding of the cautionary principle.
My understanding of the precautionary principle. So my understanding is that it is an approach to risk mitigation that asks us to look at what potential problems could arise with the technology. I think can be a fairly logical concept. I think it's often been misapplied and maybe used poorly to prevent technology from being developed rather than to actually be constructive in the development of technology. So that's my personal take on the precautionary principle. I don't know if you had any other sort of comment about why you're bringing that up, but yeah.
I have a lot, but this may not be the point.
Yeah, okay, we can talk offline maybe.
You know, Neal, we were chatting earlier a little bit about the regulatory side of this and just how agriculture is generally a highly regulated industry. And as we think through CRISPR, I mean, I can think of 3 agencies that could probably claim jurisdiction over this, FDA, EPA, and USDA. What does the regulatory environment look like for an entrepreneur who might be doing something with this?
Well, unfortunately, it's still an uncertain landscape. I think actually it was being discussed a little bit earlier this morning in one of the other sessions. So for one thing today, anyone can go to the USDA and send a letter in that says, we're developing a product, we don't think it needs to be regulated, do you agree? And they'll respond to you and let you know whether that's true or not. So a year ago, we did that with our specialty corn product, and they told us that didn't need to be regulated by the, under the BRS GMO regulations. There was a group from Penn State that did the same thing with mushrooms, and there have been many other examples of that. The USDA is now going through a process of reviewing its regulations to look at a more general approach, and they're taking a I think a really nice approach in which the outcome could well be that the types of changes I've talked about here, deletions, edits, these simple sort of swaps of one allele for another, would not be regulated as GMOs. And so I think that's actually a very smart approach they're taking. There's examples in India where the Indian government's doing something very similar. What I would say is that it's unfortunate that we have that level of uncertainty at the moment, and that's one thing we're engaging on, with the products we're starting to develop, with all the countries that might import the food products that come out of what we're doing. But I think it brings up another point, which is that the regulatory outcome is an important part of the adoption of a technology, but it's necessary and not sufficient. And so we think a lot about social license. Regulatory is a piece of that, but public perception is the other. So you come back to the issue of a GMO, is it a GMO or not? We'd like to get past this issue of just, black and white, is it a GMO or not? But we also want to just highlight the differences, certainly. And I think as while you could use CRISPR-Cas to actually, create GMO products, the approaches we're talking about of CRISPR-Cas for targeted breeding are only those types of uses where we're working with genes that naturally exist in the crop's own genome. So it's corn genes all the time in corn, rice genes all the time in rice. And so I do think that is one issue that I think many people have felt uncomfortable about, moving genes between species, whether that's a scientific level. You could debate whether that's sensible or not, but that's real. And this technology is a very different technology in that sense, either just working within the natural gene pool and harvesting natural variation, or creating variation in the same way we can do today with classical mutagenesis.
Right up front here.
How are you dealing with the, segue off the regulation, how are you dealing with the legal minefield around CRISPR-Cas with all the patent disputes and stuff? How are you able to?
Yeah. So the question is, how are you dealing with all this legal uncertainty? I would add to that, how about the market acceptance? How is the market reacting to this as well? It must have a big play into your marketing plan.
So it's a topic I would take more offline. It's a complex landscape, and bottom line, we're dealing with it carefully, and our plan is to certainly be in position to have freedom to operate in the market. We have some technology that we've licensed and developed. This will be an evolving picture for a while, and we also know there are many different tools that can be used to deliver the same sorts of outcomes. So I think ultimately many people will find ways to bring products to the market with this technology. It's probably the simplest answer I would say for now.
Okay, right here.
Is there an industry association that's asked the federal government to form back a federal advisory committee, multi-agency sit down, a one-time task force to come up with a comprehensive set of regulations? It's kind of similar to what the FDA does. They create these 2 to 3 year task forces, they sit down, and they come with almost something integrated. So is that been requested by the association? And if not, is it feasible in your judgment?
It's a fair question. So go ahead.
So I think the question was, is there an industry association that has been tasked with coming up with regulations to deal with this new technology?
Yeah, so we mentioned that there's obviously work going on already, right? FDA has got some work going on to look at this. USDA does. It's mostly within the general framework, I would say, of the coordinated framework from years gone by and current rules. Of course, there are industry groups who are looking at these issues to try to get alignment. I would say the most probably relevant one to look at, if you're interested, is Asta, the American Seed Trade Association. Fundamentally, this is a breeding technology. Asta is about breeding organizations, most of whom are small businesses trying to help bring products to the market, not large companies. And Asta spends a fair bit of time looking at how to think about the technology, how to communicate about the technology and the products from it, and ultimately, what would be a sensible regulatory framework. But I think there's still more work to be done on that front, and I don't think anyone has sort of formally asked for an organized, different review than the current processes that are underway today.
Okay. There was somebody in the back here.
Get over here.
Okay, go ahead.
Is there a mic? I can try it out. I'll try it out. In the past, I've read that the reason that GMO has really been kept to, I think it's corn, sorghum, a couple other really big cereal crops, is because regulation is so expensive. So the fact that advanced breeding might not be regulated in the same way, will that open up genetic modification and further genome research for other crops?
So the question was basically, GMO technology has been mostly applied to some very large acreage crops, like it's not just cereals, but corn, soybean, cotton, that sort of thing, right? And the question is, if there's a different regulatory landscape, would that open up the opportunity to apply this to a much wider range of crops? Is that basically, yeah. So I think it is critical. It is really important, right? It's no question that there was this, inadvertent outcome, you might say, of people worried about the technology for various reasons that led to an increase in regulatory costs, so small companies really couldn't participate. In fact, academics who used to be in land-grant universities able to bring varieties forward really couldn't either. So I think we're in a world now where if social license comes, and if regulatory framework is what I would consider appropriate given the safety risk, right, for these kinds of products that are, similar to or indistinguishable from what we do from breeding, then you will see, I would hope, small companies arise, testing technologies, and think about what the real needs are for improving, tomatoes for us, right? And I think we've all had this struggle where we go out and you buy your beefsteak tomatoes for your hamburgers or for a salad, and they don't taste very good. They've been bred for many years for probably storability and shippability. You can only breed for so many things at one time. And so I think here's an example where what we've learned about how to produce and ship and store tomato, we can take some of the learning at the genetic level and apply it to, let's say, heirloom tomatoes, and make heirloom tomatoes much more accessible and cost appropriate, more cost available for the average consumer. So I think, as we mentioned, specialty crops, disease resistance, better flavor, shelf life, maybe improved protein content for various options of plant proteins, maybe replacing animal proteins. I think all those things are possible if the regulatory, regime and public perception are suitable for this technology. So that's a very exciting opportunity, I think, for us all.
Okay. All right, Neal, I want to thank you for being here. That was really fascinating.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, audience.
Thank you.